Okay, welcome back. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask Dr. Kweku. I'm here to help you out. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at, or the next sort of phenomenon that basically causes inflation, is what we call the cost push inflation. And as the name suggests, the cost push inflation basically arises due to increase in costs in the economy, okay? Right? So when we say increase in cost, it's not really the cost of living, or it's not really the cost of goods and services related to consumers, but the cost of production, okay? So think of it as the cost of production. So every time you think of production, your mind should automatically go to the SAS curve, okay? The SAS curve, the short-term aggregate supply curve, okay? Right, because remember, aggregate supply is basically the total amount of goods and services produced in a country. Now, if the cost of production increases, well, you can't produce as much goods and services in the country, okay? Now, where do these increased costs come from, or where are they usually found, okay? Well, the increased cost generally comes from an increase in the money wage rate, okay? So now think of the money wage rate as basically salaries or wages. And now, every time you're thinking of short-term aggregate supply curve, think of yourself from the perspective, or think of yourself basically as a producer, or think from the perspective of a producer or a seller. Now, if you actually have to pay more workers, higher wages, it becomes more costly to produce. Because remember, you hire these workers to produce some good or a service. Now, you actually have to pay them more money. It's now costly to actually produce one good or a service, okay? So in that sense, you want to cut down on your costs. So you actually lay people off. Now, the thing with laying people off is that when you lay people off, essentially, that is going to actually reduce production because you don't have as much workers. Suppose you have 3 workers, right? You can produce more than in terms of having only just one worker, okay? So when you lay people off, an increase in the money wage rate would decrease production, okay? And when it decreases production, this is going to decrease the SAS curve. Okay? Right. Now, also an increase in the money price of raw materials. So basically an increase in the price of raw materials. Now, suppose you actually produce pencils. What is the raw material for pencils? Well, it's wood. Now, if wood becomes really expensive, you don't have the capability to afford as much wood as before. So it cuts down the production of pencils because you can't afford wood, which is basically used in the production of pencils. Okay, you can't afford as much wood as before. Think of, let's say you are a car company and you import auto parts from China. If the price of auto parts become expensive, you can't assemble as much cars because you actually cut down on you buying auto parts. Okay, now if you don't have as much auto parts, how many or how much cars can you basically produce? Okay, think of oil, the price of oil. If the price of oil because of maybe a war in the Middle East goes up, transportation costs increases. Now if transportation costs are increasing, right, basically it means that input costs are generally going to increase and you can't produce as much goods and services. Now if you can't produce as much goods and services, your short-term aggregate supply curve basically decreases again. Okay, so now let's see how a short-term aggregate supply curve, a decrease in the short-term aggregate supply curve leads to basically cost push inflation. Okay, so when the short-term aggregate supply curve decreases, what direction does the curve shift? Again, the short-term aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. Right, so a decrease in the short-term aggregate supply curve shifts the SAS curve to the left. As you notice, GDP decreases from 18 to 17.5 trillion, right? So initially we are point A and now we are point B, okay? And GDP decreases from 18 to 17.5 trillion, and the price level basically increases from 110 to 117 117, okay? So that's 9 trillion. I was going to say 170 trillion, but the price level is 9 trillion. Thank God, okay? Right. Now, what happens is that now you can see the actual GDP. Again, actual GDP is the point of intersection between the short-term aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve at 17.5 trillion. Okay, we know that potential GDP is 18 trillion and actual GDP is 17.5 trillion. When this happens, we have what we call a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap. It means that the economy is not producing enough, okay? Because actual GDP, which is 17.5 trillion, is less than 18 trillion dollars, which is potential GDP, okay? So we have a gap over here. Right? Every time actual GDP falls to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve, we basically have a recessionary gap. Essentially, it means that the economy is in a recession, is not producing enough goods and services, okay? So in that sense, we need to close this recessionary gap. We need to fix the recession, okay? Right. Now, to actually fix the recession, okay, basically the Federal Reserve has to react and aggregate demand basically has to increase. That is why when we currently in the COVID recession, the government actually gave out the stimulus checks. The Federal Reserve decided to print more money to basically close the recessionary gap, okay? Right, so aggregate demand must increase to close the recessionary gap so we basically can go back to normal levels in terms of GDP, okay? So the Federal Reserve will increase the money supply. We know that when money supply basically increases, people tend to feel more wealthy and aggregate demand will essentially increase, okay? When aggregate demand increases, it means that GDP essentially is increasing as well, okay? Right, so the figure illustrates an aggregate demand response, okay? So we had a recessionary gap. So initially we are at point A when we started off. We moved to point B. The Federal Reserve tries to stimulate aggregate demand, okay? So we actually try to close this gap. So aggregate demand increases and we get to a new equilibrium at point C where we have aggregate demand, the new aggregate demand curve, intersecting the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve at point C, okay? So essentially at point C, the gap is closed, okay? And we revert back to our equilibrium levels, okay? Right? So we have point A, point B, and then point C, okay? So now we revert back to our equilibrium levels, okay, of potential GDP being $18 trillion, okay? But the problem is that when aggregate demand increases, the price level increases as well. So now we've gone from 110, which we started off with at point A, to 121, which is basically at point C, okay? So the price level rises, and that is basically the cost push inflation, okay? That essentially is the cost push inflation, okay? Now, whenever we have a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, it leads to something what we call stagflation. Okay, it leads to something what we call stagflation, and stagflation is when GDP decreases and there's an increase in the price level, which is basically inflation. Okay, so that is essentially stagflation. Okay, so that is stagnated growth and inflation, hence the word stagflation. Okay, right, so when GDP decreases due to a decrease in short-term aggregate supply, okay, so stagflation actually happens when there's a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. When short-run aggregate supply decreases, GDP decreases, like in this example, decrease from 18 to 17.5 trillion, and the initial price level increases from 110 to 117, okay? And essentially you have what we call stagflation, okay? So in the United States, we had periods of stagflation. Roughly in the mid-70s, we had high periods of inflation, and we still had a recession, okay? And in the late 70s, early 80s, we also had high periods of inflation, and basically we had a recession, okay? So that is how stagflation basically occurs, right? And stagflation generally is also cost push inflation, okay? So that is how cost push inflation occurs. Again, guys, please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. send me an email or go talk to the SI or come to my office. Please, I'm imploring you to actually ask me questions to actually help you out to understand this better. Okay. Well, thanks for watching. Next time we'll be looking at causes of deflation. Okay.